The rain had started just before sunset, turning the city streets shiny and cold. People hurried along the sidewalks with coats over their heads, trying to escape the weather before it became worse. Inside a small restaurant near the center of downtown, warm yellow lights reflected softly against the windows, while quiet conversations filled the room. Plates clinked, glasses touched, and the smell of fresh bread and coffee floated through the air. Near the far corner of the restaurant stood an old black piano. Most nights, the piano was played by an older musician who knew exactly how to keep the customers relaxed while they ate. Soft music usually floated through the room like background noise nobody paid much attention to. But tonight was different. The regular pianist had not arrived. The restaurant manager kept checking his watch every few minutes while walking nervously near the entrance. Customers were beginning to notice the silence. A few even asked why the piano had not started yet. That was when the door slowly opened. A young woman stepped inside, shaking rainwater from her thin jacket. She looked around uncertainly, almost as if she regretted coming. Her dark hair was slightly wet from the storm, and she held a worn music folder tightly against her chest. Nobody really noticed her at first. She quietly walked toward the manager and spoke so softly that he had to lean closer just to hear her. "I heard you needed someone to play tonight," she said. The manager looked surprised. His eyes quickly moved from her face to the old piano in the corner. "You play?" he asked carefully. She nodded once. The manager hesitated. She looked young, nervous, not at all like someone who could handle a crowded restaurant on a busy evening. "You've played professionally before?" "A little," she answered. That answer did not help his confidence. Before he could reply, another worker rushed over carrying a tray of drinks. "Still no sign of the regular guy," the worker whispered. "People are already asking questions." The manager sighed heavily. He looked at the young woman again. She seemed uncomfortable standing there under the bright lights while strangers passed around her. "What kind of music do you play?" he asked. "Mostly piano pieces. Soft songs. Old classics." The manager rubbed his forehead. He did not have many options. Finally, he pointed toward the piano. "Fine. Just keep it simple, all right? People are eating." She gave a small nod. As she walked toward the piano, several customers turned their heads curiously. A few looked confused. One man near the center table frowned slightly. "That's the replacement?" he muttered to his friends. Another laughed quietly. "She looks terrified." The young woman pretended not to hear them, but the words still reached her ears. Her steps slowed for a second. She almost turned back. But then her fingers tightened around the music folder, and she continued walking until she reached the piano bench. The old piano looked beautiful under the restaurant lights, but up close it showed its age. Small scratches covered the surface, and a few keys were slightly faded from years of use. She sat down carefully. For a moment, she simply stared at the keys without moving. The restaurant remained loud. Conversations continued. Forks scraped against plates. Nobody seemed interested in her performance yet. A waiter passed by and whispered jokingly, "Don't fall asleep up there." A couple nearby chuckled. Her face warmed with embarrassment. She lowered her eyes. The truth was, she had almost not come at all tonight. Earlier that afternoon, she had stood outside the restaurant for nearly 20 minutes, staring through the window while trying to gather courage. She had seen the piano from outside and remembered the small paper sign hanging near the entrance. "Pianist needed tonight." She had walked away twice before finally forcing herself back. Because playing in front of people terrified her. Not because she hated music. Music was the only thing she had truly loved since childhood. But people were different. People judged. People laughed. And once, years ago, that laughter had followed her long after the performance ended. Even now, the memory still hurt. She pushed the thought away quickly. The manager gave her a look from across the room, silently asking her to begin already. She took a slow breath. Then her fingers finally touched the keys. The first notes were soft and careful, almost too quiet to hear. A few nearby customers barely glanced toward her before returning to their meals. Someone near the back continued speaking loudly on the phone. Another group laughed over drinks without paying attention at all. The young woman kept playing anyway. Simple notes, gentle melody, nothing dramatic. Exactly what the manager had asked for. But her hands trembled slightly. Every small mistake felt enormous inside her mind. She could already imagine people whispering about her. Too slow. Too nervous. Not good enough. Her shoulders tightened. One wrong note slipped through the melody. At a nearby table, somebody smirked. Guess they really hired anyone tonight, a voice whispered. Her stomach twisted painfully. For one terrible second, she considered standing up and leaving. Nobody wanted her there anyway. But then something unexpected happened. An older woman sitting alone near the window quietly set down her coffee cup and looked toward the piano with real interest. Not judgment. Interest. The young pianist noticed it immediately. The woman smiled gently and gave the smallest nod, as if encouraging her to continue. That tiny moment changed something. The young woman looked back down at the piano keys. This time her breathing slowed. Her fingers moved a little more naturally. The melody became warmer, smoother. The restaurant noise still filled the room. But now the music slowly floated through it instead of getting lost beneath it. At one table, a child stopped coloring and looked toward the piano curiously. At another, a couple paused their conversation for a moment to listen. The young woman still felt nervous, but little by little, the fear loosened its grip. She allowed herself to close her eyes briefly while playing. And suddenly memories returned. Not the painful ones, the good ones. A tiny apartment filled with sunlight. An old upright piano pushed against the wall. Small fingers struggling to reach the higher keys. Her mother standing nearby, smiling proudly every time she learned a new song. Back then, music had felt safe. Back then, she played without fear because nobody had taught her to be ashamed yet. A loud burst of laughter from the restaurant pulled her back to reality. Her eyes opened quickly. For a second, panic flashed across her face again. But the older woman near the window still watched quietly, still listening carefully. So the young pianist continued. The melody changed slightly now. Still soft, still gentle, but deeper somehow. The emotion inside the music slowly began reaching people without them realizing it. One waiter stopped walking for a moment. A customer near the entrance lowered his newspaper. Even the manager glanced over while pretending not to. The girl at the piano no longer looked quite as nervous as before. Her fingers moved more confidently across the keys now, creating a sound that felt honest instead of perfect. And that honesty began filling the room. A man seated near the piano leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "Well," he admitted quietly to his friend, "she's better than I expected." His friend nodded slowly. The young woman did not hear them this time. She was too focused on the music. Outside, rain continued falling against the windows. Inside, the restaurant slowly changed. The loud conversations softened little by little. Not because anyone was told to be quiet, but because the piano was finally giving them something worth listening to. Still, fear remained hidden inside her chest. Every new note felt like walking across thin ice, because deep down she knew how quickly people could turn cruel. She had learned that lesson once already, and the scars from that night had never fully disappeared. Her fingers slowed slightly as the memory tried returning again. Bright stage lights, crowded seats, whispers spreading through an audience. Then laughter. So much laughter. Her hands nearly froze. One wrong note escaped the piano. A customer glanced over. The young woman swallowed hard. The old fear came rushing back immediately. Her confidence cracked again. But before panic could completely take over, the older woman near the window softly began clapping along with the rhythm for just a few seconds. Not loudly. Just enough to remind her she was not alone. The young pianist looked up in surprise. The woman smiled warmly once more. And somehow, that simple kindness gave her strength she did not know she still had. She turned back to the piano. This time, when her fingers touched the keys, the sound carried something new. Not fear. Not shame. Something stronger. And slowly, one by one, more people in the restaurant began turning toward the music. The music continued flowing softly through the restaurant while rain tapped steadily against the windows outside. The young woman kept her eyes on the piano keys, trying not to notice the people staring at her now. Earlier, nobody cared that she was there. But little by little, the room had started changing. More customers were listening. Even the conversations sounded quieter than before. A waiter carrying drinks slowed down near the piano just long enough to hear the melody before moving again. At another table, a child rested his chin on both hands, completely focused on her playing. Still, the young woman could not fully relax. Fear sat deep inside her chest like a heavy stone. Every time her fingers moved across the keys, another memory tried pulling her backward. Not to this restaurant, to another stage, another piano, another crowd. Years ago, she had once believed music would become her future. Back then, she practiced for hours every single day in a tiny apartment where the walls were thin and the piano was old. Her mother used to sit nearby while sewing clothes for extra money, listening proudly as her daughter repeated the same difficult songs again and again. They did not have much, but the piano had always made the apartment feel warm. "You don't have to play perfectly," her mother would often tell her. "You just have to play honestly." At the time, the young girl believed those words completely. And for many years, she played without fear. School talent shows, small community events, tiny music halls. She never cared about being famous. She only loved the feeling music gave her. Whenever she played, the world became quieter inside her mind. But everything changed during one competition. Even now, she remembered every detail too clearly. She had been 16 years old. The competition was held inside a large theater filled with bright lights and hundreds of people. It was the biggest audience she had ever faced. Teachers, judges, parents, students. Every seat seemed occupied. Backstage, her hands had already been shaking before she even touched the piano. Another contestant standing nearby noticed her nervousness and laughed quietly with his friends. "She looks like she might faint," one of them whispered. The words stayed inside her head. When her turn finally came, she walked onto the stage feeling smaller than she ever had before. The lights blinded her. The silence felt enormous. She sat down at the piano and tried to breathe normally, but her heart beat so hard she thought everyone could hear it. Then she started playing. First, everything went fine. The opening notes sounded clean and soft. But halfway through the performance, her mind suddenly froze. Completely blank. Her fingers stopped moving. The silence that followed felt endless. Panic rushed through her body. She tried starting again, but her hands trembled too badly. Then somebody in the audience laughed. Just one person at first, but another joined. Then another. Whispers spread across the theater. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others looked amused. The young girl stared at the piano keys while her vision blurred with tears. Finally, she stood up and rushed off the stage before finishing the song. That night destroyed something inside her. Afterward, videos from the competition spread online among students at school. People joked about the girl who froze at the piano. Some classmates mocked her whenever they passed her in the hallways. Even worse, she began believing them. Little by little, she stopped playing in front of others. Then she stopped playing almost completely. Back in the restaurant, her fingers slowed for a moment as the memory faded again. The older woman near the window still listened carefully, almost as if she understood there was pain hidden inside the music. The young pianist swallowed hard and continued playing. A new melody began now, softer than before, sad in a quiet way. The restaurant seemed to notice the change immediately. A couple near the center table stopped eating completely. The manager looked toward the piano again while drying glasses behind the counter. The young woman closed her eyes briefly. This song was different. She had written parts of it herself during lonely nights when she could not sleep. Whenever fear or sadness became too heavy, she sat at her small piano at home and poured those feelings into music nobody else ever heard. Until tonight, the notes drifted through the restaurant slowly, carrying emotions she could never explain with words. One older man sitting alone near the back lowered his coffee cup and stared toward her with quiet surprise. A server whispered softly to another worker. "She's actually really good." The other nodded. "Yeah, I didn't expect this." The young pianist heard none of it. She was too lost inside the melody now. For the first time in years, she stopped trying to play perfectly. Instead, she simply played honestly, exactly the way her mother once taught her. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance while rain continued falling harder against the windows. The restaurant lights reflected softly across the piano keys as her hands moved more naturally now. Then suddenly the front door opened loudly. Cold air rushed inside. A group of 3 men entered laughing and shaking rainwater from their jackets. They immediately noticed the music. One of them glanced toward the piano and smirked. "Well, this place got fancy tonight." Another laughed. "Let's hope she knows more than one song." The comments were not especially cruel, but they were enough. Fear instantly returned. The young woman's fingers slipped slightly on the next note. Her shoulders tightened again. The old panic slowly crept back into her chest. What if she embarrassed herself again? What if people only pretended to enjoy her playing? What if the laughter started all over? Her breathing became uneven. One wrong note echoed louder than it should have. The group near the entrance chuckled quietly. The young pianist stared down at the keys, fighting the sudden urge to stop playing completely. Then something unexpected happened again. The child sitting near the stage suddenly spoke loudly enough for half the restaurant to hear. "Don't stop," he said. The room became briefly quiet. The child looked completely serious. "I like this song." A few customers smiled softly. Even the young woman looked surprised. The boy's mother looked embarrassed for interrupting, but the pianist gave the child a small grateful smile before turning back to the piano. That tiny moment helped steady her again. She took a slow breath. Then she continued. This time the melody grew stronger. Not louder. Stronger. The fear was still there, but now something else existed beside it. Courage. Not perfect courage. Not fearless confidence. Just enough strength to keep going. And somehow that made the music feel even more real. The older man near the back leaned forward slightly in his chair, fully listening now. A server near the kitchen entrance stopped pretending to work for a moment just to hear better. Even the manager no longer looked worried about the missing regular pianist. The atmosphere inside the restaurant had completely shifted. Earlier, people came only for dinner. Now many of them were staying for the music. The young woman finally noticed it too. People were listening, not judging, not laughing, listening. The realization almost overwhelmed her. For years, she had convinced herself that public playing only led to humiliation. She believed one bad performance had permanently destroyed her love for music. But tonight felt different. Tonight, nobody expected perfection from her. And strangely, that made her better. Her fingers moved across the piano with growing confidence while emotion filled every note. The music no longer sounded small or frightened. It sounded alive. The older woman near the window smiled proudly, as if watching someone slowly return to themselves after being lost for a very long time. Then, near the middle of the song, the young pianist opened her eyes and looked around the restaurant carefully for the first time since she began. People were watching her quietly now. Not with mockery, with attention, with feeling. And for the first time in many years, she realized something important. Maybe the worst moment of her life did not have to define every moment after it. The restaurant no longer sounded the way it had an hour earlier. When the young woman first sat at the piano, the room had been full of loud conversations, clinking glasses, and people barely paying attention to anything around them. Now the atmosphere felt completely different. The music had quietly taken over the space. Customers who had once ignored her were now listening carefully. Some pretended not to stare, but their eyes kept drifting back toward the piano. Even the workers moved more slowly, trying not to interrupt the mood filling the room. The young pianist noticed all of it. And strangely, instead of making her more nervous, it began giving her strength. Her fingers moved gently across the keys while soft golden light from the hanging lamps reflected off the piano's surface. The rain outside still poured steadily, making the restaurant feel even warmer inside. For the first time that night, she forgot about trying to impress anyone. She simply played. The melody changed again, becoming deeper and more emotional. It was no longer background music for dinner. It felt personal now, like every note carried a memory she had hidden for years. A couple sitting near the window slowly stopped eating altogether. An older man near the back rested both elbows on the table and listened quietly with his eyes half closed. Even the group that had laughed earlier when she arrived had gone silent. One of them whispered softly, "She's incredible." The young woman did not hear the words directly, but she could feel the difference in the room. People were no longer waiting for her to fail. They were waiting to hear what came next. That realization made her chest tighten with emotion. For years, she had avoided places exactly like this. Restaurants, public spaces, crowds, anything involving a piano and strangers watching her. After the disaster at the competition years ago, she had slowly built walls around herself. She still practiced at home, sometimes late at night, but only when nobody could hear. Her mother used to beg her not to give up. "You were happiest when you played," she once said gently. But fear had become stronger than happiness. Until tonight, her fingers moved faster now, more confidently than before. The melody rose and fell like waves, filling the restaurant with warmth and sadness at the same time. The child near the stage smiled brightly while listening. His mother softly brushed his hair back but kept her own attention fixed on the piano. Near the counter, the manager quietly leaned toward one of the waiters. "She's keeping the entire place silent," he whispered in disbelief. The waiter nodded slowly. "I've never seen customers this quiet." It was true. Even the sound of silverware had almost disappeared. The music had become the center of the room. The young woman finally allowed herself to look up while playing. At first, her eyes moved nervously from table to table. Part of her still expected judgment or mocking smiles. But instead, she saw something else. People looked emotional, interested, moved. One woman near the corner dabbed her eyes with a napkin while pretending not to. A man sitting alone smiled faintly into his coffee cup. The older woman near the window still watched proudly, almost like she had known from the beginning that this moment would happen. The pianist quickly looked back at the keys before emotions overwhelmed her. She had spent so many years believing nobody wanted to hear her play. But tonight, complete strangers were listening more carefully than she ever imagined possible. The song slowly came to an end. Her fingers pressed the final note softly. Silence followed. Real silence. Not awkward silence. The kind that happens when people are still emotionally inside the music. Then suddenly, applause filled the restaurant. Not loud cheering. Not wild shouting. Just honest clapping from people who truly meant it. The young woman froze slightly in surprise. She stared at the room as if she could not believe the sound was real. Several customers smiled toward her warmly. The child near the front clapped the hardest. Even the group of men near the entrance joined in. The pianist lowered her eyes quickly, overwhelmed. "Thank you," she whispered softly, almost too quietly for anyone to hear. The manager walked closer to the piano with an expression completely different from earlier. "Well," he said with a small laugh, "I think you just saved my evening." A few nearby customers chuckled warmly. The young woman smiled nervously. "I'm sorry if I made mistakes," she said automatically. The manager blinked in surprise. "Mistakes? Nobody cares about mistakes right now." He looked around the restaurant. "Look at this place." She slowly glanced around again. He was right. People seemed calmer, happier. Even the atmosphere felt softer than before. The tension and noise from earlier had disappeared completely. The manager shook his head in disbelief. "I asked for simple music," he said. "I didn't expect this." Before she could answer, a voice spoke from nearby. "Please keep playing." The request came from the older man sitting near the back. He held his coffee cup carefully while looking toward her with gentle eyes. "That music reminded me of someone," he added quietly. The pianist hesitated. Part of her wanted to stop while things were going well. Fear still whispered inside her mind, warning her not to push too far. But another part of her, the part she thought had disappeared years ago, wanted to continue, so she slowly nodded. Then she turned back toward the piano. The room became quiet again almost immediately. This time, when her fingers touched the keys, there was less fear inside them. Not completely gone, but weaker. She began another piece, softer at first. The melody carried warmth and longing together, almost like telling a story without words. As she played, more customers entered from the rain outside. But instead of speaking loudly or searching immediately for seats, many paused near the entrance after hearing the piano. Some stood listening for a few moments before sitting down. One worker whispered to another, "People are coming in because of the music now." The manager glanced toward the growing crowd and shook his head with amazement. The young woman still knew nothing about that. She was lost inside the piano completely. For years, she had locked away this part of herself because she believed the world only rewarded perfection. One bad performance had convinced her she did not belong on a stage. But tonight was teaching her something different. People connected with honesty more than perfection. And honest music was exactly what she was finally giving them. Halfway through the next song, the restaurant door opened again. This time, an older man stepped inside wearing a dark coat damp from rain. He looked tired, as though he had just finished a long day. At first, he seemed focused only on finding a table. Then he heard the piano. He stopped instantly. His eyes slowly turned toward the young woman. Something changed in his expression immediately. Shock, then emotion. He stood completely still near the entrance while the melody continued filling the room. One of the servers approached him politely. "Table for one?" But the man barely answered. Instead, he quietly asked, "What song is she playing?" The server looked confused. "I'm not sure." The older man kept staring toward the piano. His eyes had become distant somehow, almost as if the music had pulled him into an old memory he had not visited in years. Slowly, he walked farther inside the restaurant without taking his eyes off the pianist. Meanwhile, the young woman continued playing, unaware that someone new had entered. The melody grew more emotional now, each note flowing naturally into the next. The older man finally sat at a table close to the piano. His expression remained serious and thoughtful. Then something unexpected happened. Very quietly, almost under his breath, he whispered the next few notes before she even played them, as if he already knew the song. The pianist looked up slightly after hearing the faint voice. Their eyes met for a brief second. The man looked stunned. The young woman looked confused. But before either could speak, her hands continued moving across the keys automatically. The older man leaned back slowly in his chair, staring at the piano with visible emotion now. One of the waiters noticed immediately. "You all right, sir?" The man nodded once without taking his eyes off the performer. "Yes," he said softly. Then after a pause, he added quietly, "I haven't heard this song in over 20 years. The young woman continued playing, but the older man's words stayed in her mind. "I haven't heard this song in over 20 years. Something about the way he said it felt heavy with emotion. Not casual. Not polite conversation. It sounded personal. Her fingers moved gently across the piano keys while she tried not to lose focus. The melody remained soft and emotional, filling every corner of the restaurant. Around her, customers sat quietly, completely drawn into the music now. Even people who had arrived only minutes earlier seemed affected by the atmosphere inside the room. Outside, rain still poured against the windows, making the restaurant feel separated from the rest of the city. Warm lights reflected across glasses and tables while the piano remained the center of everything. The older man near the front kept watching her carefully. Not in the uncomfortable way some people stared. His expression looked more like disbelief, almost as if the music had opened a door to memories he thought were gone forever. The young pianist noticed him again when she reached the middle of the song. He quietly lowered his head for a moment and rubbed his eyes before looking back toward her. That small movement made her chest tighten with curiosity. Who was he? And why did this song affect him so deeply? She finished the final notes gently, letting the melody fade naturally into silence. For a second, nobody moved. Then applause filled the restaurant once again. This time it sounded louder than before. Several customers smiled warmly at her while clapping. Someone near the back even stood briefly before sitting down again. The young woman felt her face grow warm with embarrassment and surprise. She still was not used to people appreciating her music. The manager walked past carrying drinks and shook his head with a grin. "You realize people are staying longer just to listen now?" A nearby customer laughed softly. "Can you blame us?" The young pianist gave a shy smile before lowering her eyes again. Then she noticed the older man standing from his table. He approached the piano slowly, almost carefully, like someone afraid of interrupting an important moment. The closer he came, the more emotional he seemed. Finally, he stopped beside the piano. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he looked at her gently and asked, "Where did you learn that song?" The young woman blinked in surprise. "My mother used to play it," she answered quietly. "I learned it from her when I was little." The older man stared at the piano keys for a few seconds before speaking again. "That melody," he paused softly. "My wife wrote it." The young woman's eyes widened. "What?" He nodded slowly. "Many years ago." The restaurant around them suddenly felt very quiet again, even though people were still talking softly in the background. The older man pulled out the chair near the piano and sat down carefully. "She loved music more than anything," he said. "Especially the piano." The young woman listened silently. "She used to play in small places like this all the time," he continued. "Restaurants, hotels, tiny music halls where most people barely listened." A small smile appeared on his face. "But she never cared. She said even one person truly listening was enough." The young pianist felt chills run through her arms. "That song was hers?" she asked again softly. "Yes." He looked toward the rain-covered windows for a moment before continuing. "She wrote it during a difficult time in our lives. We didn't have much money back then. Things were hard. But music always helped her keep going." His voice became quieter. "She passed away over 20 years ago." The young woman lowered her eyes immediately. "I'm sorry." The older man nodded gently. "For years, I couldn't listen to piano music at all after losing her. It hurt too much." He looked back toward her with emotional eyes. "Then tonight I walked in here and suddenly heard that melody again." He gave a soft laugh filled with disbelief. "I honestly thought I was imagining things." The young pianist did not know what to say. She had played the song for years without even knowing who originally created it. Her mother had only told her it came from an old musician nobody remembered anymore. Now suddenly, the song felt even more meaningful. "How did your mother learn it?" the older man asked. The young woman thought for a moment. "She used to clean apartments years ago," she explained quietly. "One of her clients was an elderly music teacher. He gave her old sheet music nobody wanted anymore." The older man smiled faintly. "That sounds exactly like something my wife would have done. She gave her music away constantly." For the first time since arriving at the restaurant, the young woman laughed softly. A real laugh. Small but genuine. The older man noticed immediately. "You should do that more often," he said kindly. "You look less afraid when you smile." Her expression fell slightly. "I'm still working on the less afraid part." The older man studied her face carefully for a second. "You weren't nervous because of the music tonight," he said quietly. "You were nervous because of people." The truth of his words hit her instantly. She looked down at her hands resting near the piano keys. "I used to perform years ago," she admitted softly. "But something happened. You don't have to explain if you don't want to." But strangely, she did want to explain. Maybe because this man felt safe somehow. Maybe because he listened without judgment. Or maybe because tonight had already changed something inside her. So quietly, she told him. Not every detail. Just enough. The competition. The forgotten notes. The laughter. The humiliation afterward. The years she spent hiding from public performances because she believed one bad moment had ruined everything. The older man listened carefully without interrupting once. When she finally finished speaking, he stayed silent for a few seconds. Then he shook his head gently. "One audience laughed," he said. "And you allowed them to silence your music for years?" The young woman swallowed hard. "It wasn't that simple." "No," he agreed softly. "Fear never is." The restaurant noise faded around them while rain continued falling outside. Then the older man leaned slightly closer and spoke words she would remember for the rest of her life. "People who truly love music are not searching for perfection." She looked at him quietly. "They are searching for feeling," he continued. "And tonight, every person in this room felt something because of your playing." The young woman glanced around slowly. Several customers still watched the piano area with interest. Some smiled warmly when their eyes met hers. One woman lifted her glass slightly toward her in appreciation. The child near the stage waved excitedly. The young pianist felt emotion rise suddenly in her chest again. For years, she thought audiences only noticed mistakes. But tonight these strangers remembered emotions instead. The older man smiled gently as if he understood exactly what she was thinking. "My wife used to say something similar," he said quietly. "She believed music should make people feel less alone." The young woman stared down at the piano keys. Maybe that was why tonight felt so different. She had stopped trying to sound perfect. She simply played honestly. And somehow, honesty connected people more deeply than flawless notes ever could. Before she could speak again, someone near the back called out softly, "Please play another one." Another customer nodded immediately. "Yes, please." Others joined in with quiet agreement. The young pianist looked surprised. The manager laughed from behind the counter. "Looks like you're not leaving anytime soon." Several people chuckled warmly. The older man stood slowly from his chair. "I hope you keep playing," he told her gently. "Not just tonight. After tonight too." She hesitated before asking quietly, "Do you really think I should?" The older man looked toward the restaurant around them. At the silent tables, the emotional faces, the strangers connected by music. Then back at her. "I think you already know the answer." For a moment, the young woman simply stared at the piano. Then slowly, she placed her fingers back on the keys. This time, there was far less fear in her hands. And when she began playing again, the entire restaurant seemed to lean closer to listen. The moment her fingers touched the piano again, the entire restaurant became quiet. Not because anyone asked for silence. People simply wanted to hear her play. The young woman took a slow breath and let her hands move naturally across the keys. This time, she was no longer trying to hide inside the music. She was allowing herself to be seen through it. The melody began softly, almost fragile at first. Then it slowly grew stronger. Every note carried emotion now. Not only sadness but hope too. The kind of hope that appears after someone spends years believing they lost an important part of themselves forever. The older man returned quietly to his table near the piano, listening carefully with both hands wrapped around his coffee cup. His eyes never left the performer. Around the restaurant, customers stopped pretending to focus on their meals. Phones rested forgotten beside plates. Conversations faded completely. Even the kitchen workers occasionally peeked out from behind the counter just to listen. The manager leaned against the wall near the register and whispered to himself, "I've never seen this place like this before." Neither had anyone else. The restaurant no longer felt like an ordinary place on a rainy evening. It felt like something unforgettable was happening. The young pianist closed her eyes briefly while playing. Memories still floated through her mind, but now they no longer controlled her hands. For years, fear had shaped every decision she made. Fear of mistakes. Fear of judgment. Fear of becoming that embarrassed 16-year-old girl again. But tonight, something inside her had changed. Not because the fear disappeared completely, because she kept playing despite it. The melody shifted suddenly into something bolder, faster, more powerful. Several people looked at each other in surprise. The shy girl who first sat nervously at the piano earlier that evening seemed completely gone now. In her place sat someone confident enough to pour every hidden emotion into the music without holding back. Her hands moved smoothly across the keys, while the sound filled the room with energy and emotion at the same time. The child near the front smiled widely. One of the waiters stopped beside a table and whispered, "Listen to this part." Even customers walking past the restaurant outside slowed down after hearing the piano through the windows. Inside, the older man quietly lowered his head again, deeply emotional. The melody clearly reminded him of his late wife, but now there was something else in his expression too. Gratitude, as though hearing this music again after 20 years had healed something inside him. The young woman reached the middle of the performance and opened her eyes. That was when she noticed several customers recording quietly on their phones. Normally, that would have terrified her. Years ago, videos were exactly what caused her humiliation to spread after the competition disaster. But tonight felt different. Nobody was recording to mock her. They were recording because the moment mattered to them. And somehow, realizing that made her even stronger. Her fingers pressed harder against the keys as emotion poured into the next section of the song. The melody rose beautifully through the restaurant. Warm, fearless, alive. A woman near the corner wiped tears from her eyes openly now. A man sitting alone smiled softly while staring into the distance, clearly remembering someone important too. The young pianist suddenly understood what the older man meant earlier. Music really could make people feel less alone. The performance continued building, growing more emotional with every passing minute. The restaurant seemed completely frozen around the piano. Nobody wanted the moment to end. Then suddenly the front door opened again. The regular pianist had finally arrived. He stepped inside carrying a small bag over one shoulder, clearly ready to apologize for being late. Rainwater dripped from his coat while he hurried toward the manager. "I'm so sorry," he began quietly. "My car broke down and..." Then he heard the music. His words stopped instantly. The manager smiled without looking away from the piano. "Yeah," he said softly. "You might want to hear this first." The regular pianist slowly turned toward the young woman. His expression changed immediately from confusion to complete surprise. He stood silently beside the entrance for several moments while listening carefully. Finally, he shook his head slightly in disbelief. "She's incredible," he whispered. The manager laughed quietly. "That's what everybody keeps saying." The young woman still did not notice any of this. She was completely lost inside the performance now. The music became softer again, almost gentle enough to break hearts. Her fingers moved with confidence she never imagined she would feel again in front of strangers. And strangely, the more honestly she played, the more emotional the audience became. Because people were not hearing perfect piano notes. They were hearing courage. They were hearing someone slowly reclaim a piece of herself she thought was gone forever. Near the end of the song, the older man quietly stood from his table. Not to leave, simply because emotion overwhelmed him too deeply to remain seated. A few nearby customers noticed and stood as well. Then another, and another. The young woman looked up in surprise while still playing. Several people in the restaurant were now standing silently, completely focused on the piano. Her heart pounded. Not with panic this time, with disbelief. Tears almost rose into her eyes, but she forced herself to stay focused on the music. She had spent years imagining audiences laughing at her. Tonight, people were standing because her music touched them. The final section of the performance arrived. The melody grew powerful one last time before slowly softening toward the ending. The restaurant remained completely still. Even the rain outside sounded quieter somehow. The young woman pressed the final notes gently. Then everything stopped. Silence filled the room for 2 long seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The final notes still seemed to hang in the air. Then suddenly, applause exploded through the restaurant. Louder than before. Much louder. People clapped with genuine emotion. Some stood fully now while applauding. Others wiped tears from their faces while smiling. The child near the stage cheered loudly. The regular pianist himself began clapping while shaking his head in amazement. The young woman stared around the room completely overwhelmed. Her hands trembled slightly again, but not from fear this time. Emotion. Pure emotion. She quickly lowered her face, trying to hide tears gathering in her eyes. But the older woman near the window smiled warmly and nodded as if silently telling her not to hide anymore. The manager approached the piano slowly. "You know," he said softly enough for only her to hear. "When you walked in tonight, I almost said no." The young woman gave a nervous laugh through tears. "I probably would have understood." "No," he said immediately. "I would have been wrong." He looked around the restaurant. "Everyone here is going to remember tonight." Several nearby customers nodded in agreement after overhearing him. One woman stepped closer and said softly, "Thank you for playing." Then another customer added, "That was beautiful." Soon more people gathered around the piano, each wanting to say something kind. The young woman barely knew how to respond. She was not used to this kind of attention. Not kind attention. The regular pianist finally approached too. "I've been playing here for 8 years, he admitted honestly, "and I've never seen a room react like that." The young woman looked embarrassed. "I'm sure you're much better than me." He laughed gently. "Maybe technically," he said, "but tonight wasn't about technique." The older man near the table smiled quietly after hearing that, because he understood the truth better than anyone. Tonight was about feeling, and the young woman had given the entire restaurant something real. For the first time in years, she no longer felt like the girl who failed on stage. Tonight, she finally felt like a pianist again. The applause lasted far longer than the young woman expected. Even after the music ended, people continued clapping warmly around the restaurant. Some customers remained standing while others smiled toward the piano with emotional faces. The young pianist sat frozen on the bench for a moment, almost unable to process what was happening. This was not supposed to happen. She had walked into the restaurant earlier expecting embarrassment at best and humiliation at worst. She only wanted a small chance to play again, maybe prove something quietly to herself before disappearing back into her normal life. Instead, strangers were looking at her like she had given them something meaningful. The feeling overwhelmed her completely. The older man slowly approached the piano once more, while the applause finally faded into soft conversations around the room. "You reminded people how powerful music can be," he said gently. The young woman shook her head quickly, still emotional. "I was terrified the entire time." He smiled softly. "Most brave people are." His words stayed with her. The manager suddenly clapped his hands together loudly from near the counter. "All right," he announced with a grin. "Anyone ordering dessert tonight gets free coffee." The restaurant laughed warmly. One customer pointed toward the pianist jokingly. "Only if she keeps playing." Several people agreed immediately. The young woman laughed nervously while wiping quickly beneath her eyes. "I think she deserves a short break first," the regular pianist said kindly. That made everyone laugh again. The atmosphere inside the restaurant felt lighter now, almost joyful. Earlier in the evening, the place had simply been another busy restaurant full of strangers. But somehow the music had connected everyone together. The child who had encouraged her earlier walked closer with his mother beside him. "You play way better than videos online," he said honestly. His mother looked horrified. "I'm sorry." But the young pianist laughed softly. "It's okay." The boy looked up at her seriously. "You looked scared at first." "I was scared. But then you weren't." The young woman paused for a moment. Then she smiled gently. "I think I forgot to be scared." The child nodded proudly like he understood exactly what she meant. His mother smiled warmly before guiding him back toward their table. Nearby, several customers continued speaking about the performance. "I've never seen a restaurant go completely silent before. She made everyone emotional. That last song was unbelievable." The young pianist heard bits of the conversations and still struggled to believe they were about her. For years, she had trained herself to expect criticism every time she touched a piano in front of others. Even compliments used to make her suspicious because she always assumed people were only being polite. But tonight felt genuine. The older woman near the window finally stood from her table and slowly walked toward the piano. Up close, her smile looked even kinder. "I knew you had something special the moment you started," she said softly. The young woman looked surprised. "Really?" Even when I was making mistakes. The woman gave a quiet laugh. Especially then. The pianist blinked in confusion. When people play perfectly all the time, the older woman explained, sometimes it feels cold. But tonight you played like someone telling the truth. The young woman looked down at the piano keys again. Nobody had ever described her music that way before. The older woman reached gently into her purse and placed a folded napkin beside the piano. There's my number, she said. My brother owns a small music cafe across town. They host live performances every weekend. The young woman's eyes widened immediately. Oh, I couldn't. Yes, you could. The older woman interrupted kindly. And I think you should. Before the pianist could answer, the manager suddenly walked over holding a phone. You may want to see this. He turned the screen toward her. A short video clip of her performance had already been uploaded online by one of the customers. The comments underneath continued appearing rapidly. Who is she? This gave me chills. I would sit in that restaurant for hours just to hear this music. She plays with so much emotion. The young woman stared silently at the screen. Years ago, videos online had destroyed her confidence. Tonight, a video was rebuilding it. The difference felt unreal. The manager smiled proudly. Looks like half the city is about to want a reservation here. The regular pianist laughed. You're welcome. The room filled with more laughter. The young woman finally stood slowly from the piano bench, her legs slightly shaky after sitting for so long. The older man who recognized his late wife's song stepped closer once more. I want to thank you, he said quietly. You already did. No, he replied gently. I really mean it. His eyes became emotional again. For 20 years, hearing that melody hurt too much. Tonight was the first time it made me smile again. The young woman felt tears rise in her eyes once more. I'm glad, she whispered. The older man nodded slowly. My wife used to believe music could heal people, he said. Tonight, I think she would have been very proud hearing you play. For a moment, the young woman could not speak at all. All those years she spent hiding from the world suddenly felt distant now, almost like another life entirely. Not because the painful memories disappeared, but because tonight proved they no longer controlled her future. The restaurant slowly returned to normal conversation again, though many customers still glanced toward the piano from time to time. Several people stopped by before leaving just to thank her personally. One older couple held hands while telling her the music reminded them of when they first met. A tired nurse finishing a late shift quietly admitted she almost cried during one song because it helped her forget an exhausting week. Even the group of men who joked about her earlier apologized. We thought you'd play background music, one admitted honestly. We didn't expect all this. The young woman smiled softly. Neither did I. Hours later, the rain outside finally stopped. Customers slowly began leaving the restaurant one by one until only a few tables remained occupied. The manager locked the front door and stretched tiredly. Well, he said with a grin, you definitely have a job here if you want one. The young woman laughed nervously again. You're serious? Completely. The regular pianist nodded immediately. Honestly, I'd like to hear you play here again too. The young woman looked back toward the piano. Earlier that evening, the instrument had felt intimidating, like a test waiting for her to fail. Now it felt different, familiar, safe, like home. She slowly ran her fingertips across the faded piano keys. I think, she said quietly, I'd like that. The manager smiled. Good, because customers are already asking when you'll be back. A small laugh escaped her again. For years, she believed audiences only remembered her worst moment. Now people hoped to hear her again. Eventually, she gathered her old music folder and prepared to leave. The restaurant workers waved goodbye warmly while finishing their cleanup. As she reached the door, the older man called out softly behind her. One more thing. She turned. He smiled gently. Don't disappear again. The young woman looked at him for a moment before nodding slowly. I won't. Then she stepped outside into the cool night air. The rain had stopped completely now. The wet streets reflected city lights like scattered gold across the pavement. Everything felt strangely peaceful. She stood there quietly for a moment, holding her music folder against her chest. Earlier that same evening, she had nearly walked away from the restaurant out of fear. If she had listened to that fear, none of this would have happened. No music, no connection, no healing, no second chance. A small smile slowly appeared on her face. Then her phone buzzed inside her pocket. She pulled it out and stared in shock. Messages. Dozens of them. The performance video had spread farther online already. People were sharing clips, leaving kind comments, asking where she would perform next. The young woman looked down at the screen while emotion filled her chest all over again. For years, she thought her story ended with failure. Tonight proved it was only the beginning. A week later, she returned to the same restaurant again. But this time, something was different. When she opened the door, people immediately recognized her. The manager pointed proudly toward the piano. Customers smiled warmly before she even sat down. And for the first time in many years, the young woman walked toward the piano without fear following behind her.